It was a cloudy, humid afternoon in the upscale neighborhood of Crestview. The streets, lined with tall oaks and pristine, freshly mowed lawns, were mostly quiet. Darren Mitchell, a tall, well-dressed black man in his early 40s, was walking leisurely down Oak Ridge Avenue. He had just finished a casual business meeting at a nearby cafe and was heading toward his parked car, a sleek black sedan that reflected his quiet but powerful presence. Darren wore a dark blazer over a crisp white shirt, with his leather shoes tapping lightly on the sidewalk as he approached his car. He reached into his pocket for his keys, his mind already shifting to the next meeting of the day. He had a busy schedule, but Darren was always composed, the type of man who seemed to have everything under control. But today, things would slip out of his hands in ways he hadn't imagined. As he neared his car, he noticed a police cruiser slowly roll to a stop a few yards behind him. Out of habit, Darren tensed slightly, his father's old advice echoing in his mind. As a young black man growing up, his father had always warned him about how to deal with the police. Never provoke, always stay calm, and make sure to stay alive. It was an unfortunate, bitter truth that Darren had learned to live with, despite his professional success and years spent building a life far removed from the systemic biases he had faced. The cruiser doors opened and two white officers stepped out. Sergeant Davis, a bulky man with a military-style crew cut and a stern, disapproving gaze, led the way. Officer Wyatt, younger and visibly more eager, followed closely behind. Darren could feel their eyes on him even before they spoke. He instinctively knew this was about to become a situation. "Sir, can you stop for a moment?" Davis called out, his voice authoritative and laced with a subtle hostility that Darren had heard many times before. Darren turned, maintaining his composure. He had been through this before, though it was no less irritating or unjust. He could feel a knot tightening in his stomach, but outwardly, he remained calm. "Yes, officer," he replied, his voice steady. "Is there a problem?" "We received a report of a suspicious individual in the area and you matched the description," Davis said, narrowing his eyes as he looked Darren up and down. Suspicious individual. Darren's heartbeat quickened, though he kept his face impassive. He had been here before, wrongfully accused, singled out simply for existing in a neighborhood that wasn't used to seeing someone like him. He kept his voice measured. "I'm just walking to my car. What description exactly am I matching?" Wyatt shifted beside Davis, his hand moving subtly toward his belt, hovering near his holstered weapon. Darren noticed the motion immediately. It was the telltale sign of an officer preparing for trouble, even though Darren had done nothing to provoke them. He had seen it too many times. "Let's see some identification," Davis interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. His gaze didn't soften, didn't relax, and Darren realized there would be no easing the tension here. He sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He reached carefully into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. "Here's my ID," he said, handing over his driver's license. "But I'd still like to know what I'm being accused of." Davis barely glanced at the license before handing it back, his demeanor unchanged. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, ignoring Darren's question altogether. "I just came from a meeting at the cafe down the street," Darren replied evenly, keeping his tone polite. "Is there something specific I've done wrong?" Davis stepped closer, his posture more aggressive now, as if Darren's calmness were provoking him. "Mind if we take a look inside your car?" That was it. Darren knew what this was. It wasn't about any suspicious individual. It was about power, and they were asserting theirs. He had a choice: comply and let them walk all over his rights, or stand his ground and risk the consequences. He'd been through this before, but it never got easier. "I do mind," Darren said, keeping his voice firm but non-confrontational. "Unless there's a legitimate reason for you to search my car, I'd rather not." The air between them thickened with tension. Wyatt stepped forward now, his hand still near his weapon. "Are you refusing a lawful request?" he asked, his tone sharper now. Darren held their gaze. "I'm refusing an unlawful one," he said, knowing full well what might happen next. In a flash, Davis moved, grabbing Darren's arm and yanking it behind his back. Darren winced as his arm was twisted painfully. Before he could react, Wyatt was on him as well, shoving him against the police car. The metallic taste of fear surged through Darren, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't resisting. He couldn't give them any reason to escalate further. "You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting a lawful investigation," Davis said coldly as he snapped the handcuffs around Darren's wrists. Darren's heart pounded in his chest, but outwardly, he remained composed. He had done nothing wrong, and they knew it. But this wasn't about right or wrong. It was about control, about power, and about the subtle, insidious racism that still permeated places like Crestview. As they shoved Darren into the back of the police car, he glanced around, seeing a few passers-by watching with wide eyes. One woman in particular had her phone out, recording the entire encounter. A flicker of hope stirred in Darren's chest. At least there would be witnesses this time. The door slammed shut and the cruiser pulled away, leaving the quiet streets of Crestview behind. The arrest of Darren Mitchell didn't go unnoticed. Crestview wasn't used to scenes like this, especially in broad daylight, in the middle of a quiet neighborhood. The video footage of the incident, taken by a young woman walking her dog, quickly found its way to social media. Within minutes, the hashtags began to spread. Justice for Darren, profiling in Crestview, and buying Crestview police. People were outraged, but many in the neighborhood were simply shocked. This kind of thing wasn't supposed to happen here, in their well-manicured, peaceful suburb. But it was happening, and it was unfolding before their eyes. As the police cruiser sped away with Darren in the back, a small crowd began to gather near the spot where he had been arrested. They had seen the arrest unfold, and though they weren't sure of all the details, something about it felt wrong. A young man with a skateboard under his arm muttered to his friend, "That was messed up. He didn't even resist." An older woman standing on her front lawn shook her head in disbelief. "This is Crestview," she whispered to her husband. "Things like this don't happen here." But they were happening. Darren's arrest had set off a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. Back in the police cruiser, Darren sat silently, staring out the window at the passing streets. He knew this wasn't the end of the story. His arrest had been unjust, but he also knew that this was an opportunity. The world had seen what happened, and the videos being shared online would work in his favor. He had seen these moments spiral out of control before, but he had one advantage that the officers didn't know about yet. At the police station, Darren was processed like any other suspect. The booking officer, tired and uninterested, barely looked up as he took Darren's fingerprints and personal information. "Another day, another suspect," the officer mumbled under his breath. Officer Wyatt and Sergeant Davis exchanged smug glances as they watched Darren from across the room. They thought they had done their duty, bringing in another troublemaker. To them, Darren was just another black man who needed to be taught a lesson, but they had no idea who they had really arrested. By the time Darren was placed in a holding cell, the tension in the station was palpable. Unbeknownst to Davis and Wyatt, the video of Darren's arrest had gone viral, and people were demanding answers. The police station's phone lines were already ringing with calls from concerned citizens, and outside, a small crowd was beginning to form, fueled by the outrage spreading through social media. Back in the holding cell, Darren remained composed. He had been through worse, and he knew how to play the long game. He knew that this wasn't just about him. This was about something much bigger, about justice, about accountability, and about making sure that the officers who thought they could act without consequence learned a hard lesson. Darren wasn't just anyone, and soon enough, they'd find out. Once Darren was brought into the station, the usual procedure unfolded with cold efficiency. He was fingerprinted, his personal items taken and logged into evidence. Officer Wyatt stood nearby, filling out paperwork with a self-satisfied smirk that Darren didn't miss. The officers believed they had neutralized a threat, Though what threat, Darren couldn't be sure. He had done nothing wrong, committed no crime, and resisted no lawful command. But in the eyes of these officers, his presence alone had been enough to warrant suspicion. Sergeant Davis, leaning casually against the wall, watched Darren as if expecting him to snap or lash out. But Darren remained calm, his mind already turning over the legal battle that was about to unfold. This wasn't just about his own experience. This was about the thousands of black men and women who had been subjected to the same treatment but had lacked the platform or resources to fight back. Darren knew that his arrest was about to become a flashpoint for something much bigger. Once the booking process was complete, Darren was led down the dimly lit hallway to a holding cell in the back of the station. The cell was small, barely wide enough for the metal bench bolted to the wall. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant with an underlying staleness that reminded Darren of every other holding cell he had seen over the years in his line of work. As the cell door clanged shut behind him, Darren sat down on the bench and closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. He knew better than to let his emotions show. He knew the game that officers like Davis and Wyatt played, baiting their suspects into reacting so they could justify harsher treatment. But Darren wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He didn't have to wait long for things to start moving. Across town, in a sleek downtown office, Senator Malcolm Grant, Darren's older brother, was in the middle of an important meeting when his phone buzzed insistently on the table. Normally, Grant wouldn't have checked it during a meeting, but something told him this was important. As he glanced at the screen, his stomach dropped. A text message with a video link. The message read, "Is this your brother?" Senator Grant clicked the link and his heart pounded as he watched the footage of Darren's arrest, the officers roughly handcuffing him and shoving him into the police cruiser. The crowd's murmurs of disbelief echoed in the background of the video. Grant's hand shook as he watched. Darren had been arrested, without cause, from the looks of it, and the officers had no idea who they were dealing with. Within moments, Grant was on the phone with his contacts, making calls that would send shockwaves through the Crestview Police Department. He knew exactly how to handle this, and he knew that when the dust settled, those officers would wish they had never laid a hand on his brother. Back at the Crestview Police Department, Sergeant Davis sat at his desk, reviewing the arrest paperwork. He felt a sense of satisfaction. Another day, another arrest. To him, Darren was just another suspect, another name to add to the system. Davis glanced over at Officer Wyatt, who was leaning back in his chair, a smug grin on his face. "Guy thought he could just walk away like that," Wyatt muttered, shaking his head. "They always think they know better, don't they?" Davis grunted in agreement, barely paying attention. His mind was already moving on to the next task, eager to wrap up the paperwork so he could clock out for the day. But then, the phone on his desk rang. "Sergeant Davis," he answered, his voice clipped. On the other end of the line, there was a moment of silence before a deep, commanding voice spoke. "Sergeant Davis, this is Senator Malcolm Grant." Davis froze, his brain struggling to process what he had just heard. Senator Malcolm Grant? His thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Why was a senator calling him? And why did the voice sound so cold, so measured? "I believe you have just arrested my brother Darren Mitchell," the senator continued, his voice low and controlled, but with a sharp edge that Davis immediately recognized as dangerous. Davis's heart dropped into his stomach. His mouth went dry, and his grip tightened on the phone. I'm sorry, Senator. Who did you say?" "You heard me," Senator Grant said, his voice hardening. "My brother, Darren Mitchell. He's currently sitting in your holding cell, and I'm calling to make sure you understand the gravity of this situation." Davis's mind reeled. Darren Mitchell? The name hadn't meant anything to him at the time of the arrest, but now it all clicked into place. He had heard of Darren Mitchell before, though he hadn't made the connection when he glanced at the ID. Darren Mitchell wasn't just any lawyer. He was one of the most high-profile civil rights attorneys in the country. He had testified before Congress, filed lawsuits against police departments, and was a key figure in the fight for justice and accountability. Suddenly, Davis felt as if the walls were closing in around him. He had arrested Darren Mitchell, and not only that, he had done it without cause based solely on a hunch, on the assumption that a black man walking through Crestview couldn't possibly belong there. I'm sorry, Senator, Davis stammered, struggling to maintain control of the conversation. I wasn't aware of who your brother was. We were responding to reports of suspicious activity and— You arrested him because he's black, Senator Grant interrupted, his voice now laced with anger. Don't try to spin this any other way. You and your officers profiled my brother, and now you've walked straight into a legal nightmare. Davis's hands shook as he tried to respond, but no words came out. He was in over his head. This was no ordinary arrest. Darren Mitchell wasn't just a lawyer, he was a nationally recognized figure, and his wrongful arrest would bring a firestorm of attention. It wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was about to become a public scandal, and Davis knew that the entire department could be dragged down with him. Senator Grant's voice cut through Davis's panic. I expect my brother to be released immediately, and I expect an official apology from your department. If that doesn't happen, I will personally ensure that this incident becomes a national news story. Do you understand me, Sergeant Davis? Davis nodded, though the senator couldn't see him. Yes, Senator, he managed to choke out. We'll take care of it right away. Good, Senator Grant replied coldly. Because if you don't, I'll make sure that Crestview PD becomes the poster child for everything that's wrong with policing in America. The line went dead. Davis sat there for a long moment, staring blankly at the phone in his hand. His pulse pounded in his ears, and he felt like he might be sick. He had arrested the brother of a sitting U.S. senator, one of the most powerful civil rights attorneys in the country, and now the weight of that mistake was crushing down on him. He slammed the phone down on the desk, startling Wyatt, who had been dozing off in his chair. What's wrong? Wyatt asked, frowning at Davis's pale face. We're in trouble, Davis muttered, his voice shaking. Big trouble. Wyatt sat up, suddenly alert. What do you mean? What's going on? Davis ran a hand through his hair, trying to figure out how they could possibly fix this. The guy we arrested, Darren Mitchell, he's not just some random lawyer. He's the brother of Senator Malcolm Grant. Wyatt blinked, not fully understanding. Wait, Senator Grant? That's his brother? Davis nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, and he's one of the top civil rights attorneys in the country. We just arrested the wrong guy. Wyatt's face went pale. He had been so smug, so sure that they had made the right call. But now the gravity of the situation was sinking in. They hadn't just made a mistake. They had made the kind of mistake that could ruin careers, destroy reputations, and bring down the entire department. What do we do? Wyatt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Davis didn't have an answer. His mind was spinning with the possibilities, each one worse than the last. They were in way over their heads, and there was no easy way out. The only thing they could do now was try to contain the damage, but even that seemed impossible. We have to let him go, Davis finally said, though the words felt like a death sentence. We have to release him, now. And then we have to figure out how to clean this up before it blows up in our faces. Wyatt nodded, but the fear in his eyes mirrored Davis's own. They had just made the biggest mistake of their careers, and now the only thing they could do was wait for the fallout. The panic inside the Crestview Police Department was immediate and palpable. After the phone call from Senator Grant, Sergeant Davis knew he had no time to waste. His mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears as he stood from his desk and marched down the hallway toward the holding cells. The weight of what he had done, what they had all done, pressed down on him like a vice. As Davis walked past the front desk, he noticed the station's receptionist on the phone, her voice low but urgent. She glanced up at him, her eyes wide with concern. The phones had been ringing off the hook ever since the arrest footage went viral, with reporters and concerned citizens demanding answers. The news was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Outside the station, a crowd had begun to gather. What had started as a handful of people recording the arrest had now grown into a full-blown protest. People were holding signs, chanting Darren's name, and demanding his release. The tension was growing by the minute, and Davis could feel it seeping into every corner of the station. He reached the holding cell area, where Officer Wyatt was pacing nervously outside the door. Wyatt looked up as Davis approached, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" Wyatt asked again, his voice trembling. "This is bad, Davis. This is really bad." "I know it's bad," Davis snapped, his frustration boiling over. "We have to release him, now, before this gets any worse." Wyatt nodded quickly, moving to unlock the cell door. As he did, Darren Mitchell sat calmly on the bench inside, his expression unreadable. He had been sitting there for hours, but he hadn't lost his composure. If anything, Darren looked more in control now than ever. Davis cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Mr. Mitchell," he said stiffly, "you're free to go." Darren didn't move at first. He simply stared at Davis, his eyes sharp and calculating. He knew exactly what was happening. The officers were scrambling, trying to fix the mess they had made, but Darren wasn't about to make it easy for them. "And why am I free to go, Sergeant?" Darren asked, his voice calm but laced with steel. Davis shifted uncomfortably. "There's been, a misunderstanding. We've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that you were wrongfully detained. We apologize for the inconvenience." Darren stood slowly, his gaze never leaving Davis's. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice low. "Is that what we're calling it?" Davis swallowed hard, knowing full well that this was more than just a misunderstanding. This was a catastrophe, and the real reckoning hadn't even begun yet. Darren was a lawyer. He knew how to play this game better than anyone, and Davis could feel the walls closing in. "We're deeply sorry," Davis said again, though the words felt hollow. Darren nodded, though his expression remained hard. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," he said simply, before stepping out of the cell. As Darren walked out of the holding area, Davis felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Just as Darren walked out of the holding area, the tension in the Crestview Police Department reached a breaking point. The phone lines were ringing nonstop. The noise from the crowd outside was growing louder by the minute, and every officer in the building could feel the pressure mounting. But the real storm hit when the front doors of the station swung open and Chief Angela Russo strode inside. Chief Russo was not one to tolerate mistakes, especially not ones that could ignite public outrage. She was a no-nonsense leader, with a reputation for running a tight ship, and her sharp gaze alone was enough to send shivers through the department. She had built her career on ensuring that her officers followed protocol to the letter. Today, however, her command had failed her in the most spectacular way possible. Russo had been alerted to the situation when her phone exploded with notifications during a meeting across town. At first, she dismissed it as a routine arrest gone slightly awry, but then she saw the video. The footage of Darren Mitchell's arrest had already gone viral, and the comments were vicious. Words like racist profiling and police brutality were lighting up social media, and that was before she even realized who Darren Mitchell truly was. As soon as she understood the gravity of the situation, Russo rushed back to the station. By the time she arrived, it was clear that the department had a full-blown crisis on its hands. And if anyone thought they were in trouble before, they were about to find out just how much worse it could get. "Where is Sergeant Davis?" Russo barked as she entered the bullpen, her eyes blazing with anger. One of the junior officers scrambled to his feet and pointed down the hall. "He's in the back with Officer Wyatt, Chief. They just released the man they arrested." Without another word, Russo marched toward the holding cells, her footsteps heavy with purpose. The officers in the station exchanged uneasy glances. They had never seen the chief like this. Russo was known for being calm and collected under pressure, but today she looked like a woman on the verge of an explosion. When she reached the hallway, she found Davis and Wyatt standing outside the holding cell, looking like two kids who had just been caught stealing from the cookie jar. Both men stiffened when they saw her, their faces going pale. "Sergeant Davis," Russo said coldly, her voice slicing through the air like a whip. "What the hell is going on here?" Davis stammered, clearly unprepared for the chief's fury. Chief Russo, I can explain. Russo didn't give him the chance. I don't need an explanation, she snapped. I already know exactly what happened. You and Officer Wyatt just arrested one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country, a man who happens to be the brother of a sitting U.S. senator, and you did it without cause. Davis opened his mouth to respond, but Russo wasn't finished. This is a disaster, Davis. Do you have any idea what you've done? We're already trending nationwide. Reporters are outside, protesters are gathering, and we're about 5 minutes away from a full-blown media circus. You've turned this department into a national scandal. Wyatt tried to speak up, his voice trembling. Chief, we didn't know who he was. We thought... Thought what? Russo snapped, turning her sharp gaze on Wyatt. That you could just profile a black man walking down the street and arrest him because he looked suspicious? Do you realize that this kind of behavior is exactly what people are protesting about all over the country? You just handed them a perfect example on a silver platter. Davis's hands were shaking as he tried to regain some control of the situation. Chief, we've already released him. We've apologized. Can't we just move on from this? Russo laughed bitterly. Move on? Do you really think this is just going to go away? Darren Mitchell isn't just any man, Davis. He's a lawyer who specializes in civil rights and police misconduct. He's going to drag this department through every courtroom in the country if we're not careful. You've given him all the ammunition he needs to take us down. The weight of her words settled over the two officers like a heavy fog. Wyatt looked like he was about to be sick, and Davis couldn't even meet Russo's gaze. Before anyone could say another word, a young officer rushed into the hallway, his face pale and panicked. Chief Russo, you need to come to the front desk right away. There's someone here to see you. Russo clenched her jaw, already anticipating the worst. Who is it? The officer swallowed nervously. A federal agent, Chief. He says it's urgent. The air in the hallway seemed to freeze. Russo's heart sank. A federal agent? This was worse than she thought. Much worse. If the feds were getting involved, it meant that Darren Mitchell's arrest was already attracting attention at the highest levels of government. Where is he? Russo demanded. In the front lobby, the officer replied. He's waiting for you. Without another word, Russo turned on her heel and marched back toward the front of the station. Davis and Wyatt exchanged nervous glances, knowing that whatever was about to happen next, they were in deeper trouble than they could have ever imagined. When Russo reached the front lobby, she spotted the federal agent immediately. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and his presence commanded attention. His badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his eyes locked onto Russo the moment she entered the room. Chief Russo, the agent said, stepping forward. I'm Agent Mark Williams with the Department of Justice. We need to talk. Russo felt her pulse quicken. She had dealt with federal agents before, but something about this man's tone, about the way he carried himself, told her that this was no ordinary visit. Agent Williams, Russo replied, trying to keep her voice steady. What can I do for you? Williams didn't waste any time. I'm here regarding the arrest of Darren Mitchell. I'm sure you're aware that Mr. Mitchell is a key figure in an ongoing investigation into police misconduct, and his wrongful arrest has significant implications for your department. Russo's stomach dropped. I see. And what are those implications exactly? Williams's gaze hardened. Mr. Mitchell is working closely with the Department of Justice to gather evidence of systemic racism and corruption within local police departments. His arrest today has the potential to derail months of work, and if we don't handle this carefully, it could become a national crisis. Russo felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a catastrophe that could destroy her entire career, not to mention the reputation of the Crestview Police Department. I understand, Russo said, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you need from us? Williams didn't hesitate. You will release Mr. Mitchell with a formal apology from your department. Additionally, you will cooperate fully with our investigation into today's events. If there's any resistance, I will personally ensure that your department faces the full weight of federal oversight. Russo nodded, her mind racing. There was no way out of this. They had to cooperate, or everything would come crashing down. Understood, Agent Williams. We'll comply with your requests. Williams gave a curt nod, his expression unchanging. Good, because the eyes of the country are on Crestview right now, and one wrong move could be the end of your department. With that, Williams turned and walked out of the station, leaving Russo standing alone in the lobby, the weight of her department's future resting squarely on her shoulders. The sun was beginning to set over Crestview as Darren Mitchell walked out of the police station, his head held high. The air outside was thick with tension, but there was a quiet resolve in Darren's step as he approached the crowd gathered just beyond the station steps. Reporters and protesters had swarmed the building, the sheer volume of bodies creating an almost electric atmosphere. Signs reading, "Justice for Darren" and "End Police Racism" waved in the air, while chants of "Let him go" and "No more profiling" echoed through the streets. It was clear that Darren's wrongful arrest had struck a chord, not just with the local community but with people across the nation who were now glued to the viral videos circulating on social media. Darren scanned the crowd and saw familiar faces, friends, family members, and colleagues who had come to support him. His brother, Senator Malcolm Grant, stood near the front, his face a mask of fury and concern. Behind the senator were civil rights activists, local leaders, and everyday citizens who had all gathered for the same reason: justice. Darren paused for a moment, letting the enormity of the moment sink in. He had been through this before: arrests, confrontations with law enforcement, and moments where the system had tried to break him. But this time it felt different. This time the world was watching. He took a deep breath and stepped up to the hastily assembled podium that had been set up for the press conference. The crowd quieted, and the only sounds that could be heard were the clicking of cameras and the distant hum of traffic. Darren's calm, composed demeanor did nothing to mask the intensity of the message he was about to deliver. "Thank you all for being here today," Darren began, his voice strong and steady. "I appreciate the support, but let me be clear, this isn't just about me." The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes fixed on Darren as he spoke. "This is about every black man and woman who has been unjustly arrested, harassed, or treated like a criminal simply for existing. Today it was me. Tomorrow it could be someone else. And that is the real issue we need to address." Darren paused, letting his words sink in. He could feel the energy of the crowd, the anger and frustration that had been building for so long, bubbling just beneath the surface. "The officers who arrested me today didn't know who I was," Darren continued. "But that shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter if I'm a lawyer, a senator's brother, or someone without a name or title. We should all be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of our background or skin color. And until that happens, until we dismantle the systems that allow this kind of injustice to continue, we will keep fighting." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in support of Darren's words. Reporters jostled for position, shouting questions and capturing every moment on camera. Darren raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "This isn't the end. This is only the beginning. The officers involved in my arrest will be held accountable, but we must go further. We must demand real change, at every level of law enforcement, from the streets to the courts and beyond. We must stand together to ensure that no one else has to go through what I did today." He looked out over the sea of faces, feeling a sense of solidarity that bolstered his resolve. "This is our moment. Let's not waste it." With that, Darren stepped down from the podium, and the crowd surged forward, applauding, cheering, and chanting for justice. The media clamored for interviews, but Darren waved them off for the moment. This wasn't about gaining personal attention. It was about focusing the spotlight on the broader issue of police reform and racial justice. As Darren made his way through the crowd, he embraced his brother Malcolm, who pulled him into a tight hug. "You okay?" Malcolm asked, his voice thick with emotion. Darren nodded. "I'm fine, but this isn't over. We've got a lot of work to do." Malcolm nodded in agreement. We'll make sure they're held accountable, Darren. I promise you that. Darren knew his brother would make good on that promise. Together they were a formidable force, Darren with his legal expertise and Malcolm with his political clout. But even more importantly, they had the power of the people behind them now. The nation had seen what happened and there was no going back. As Darren walked away from the police station, surrounded by supporters, the future felt uncertain but charged with possibility. The fight for justice was far from over, but Darren was ready for it. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life, and now, the system that had tried to break him was about to face the full force of accountability. As Darren left the police station, surrounded by family, friends, and supporters, the weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He had spent years fighting for civil rights, pushing for reform in the justice system, and challenging the very kind of systemic racism he had just personally experienced. But what happened today was more than just another unjust arrest. It had the potential to crack open something much larger. While the crowd outside the station continued to chant for justice, Darren's mind was already moving ahead. He had seen firsthand how incidents like this could either ignite lasting change or become lost in the media frenzy. But with his brother Senator Malcolm Grant by his side, and his deep connections within the legal and civil rights communities, Darren knew this wasn't going to be forgotten. In fact, it was about to blow wide open. Later that evening, Darren gathered with his legal team at his brother's home. The mood in the room was tense but focused. His lawyers, some of the best civil rights attorneys in the country, were already working on the next steps. But what Darren revealed to them next changed the scope of the conversation entirely. "I've been working on something," Darren said, his voice low but steady. "And it's bigger than just today's arrest." Everyone in the room went quiet, their attention laser-focused on Darren. "For months now, I've been in contact with federal investigators," he explained. "They've been looking into the Crestview Police Department for patterns of racial profiling, corruption, and misconduct. There have been countless reports of abuse, especially targeting Black and brown communities. I've been helping to gather evidence for a federal case." The room buzzed with shock. His lead attorney, Marcus Taylor, leaned forward. "You're saying this arrest wasn't just a coincidence?" Darren nodded. "Exactly. What happened today wasn't just about me being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the final piece of the puzzle. This department has been under investigation for a long time, and they've just handed us the smoking gun." Taylor exchanged a glance with the others. "You're telling us that the Department of Justice is involved?" "They've been building a case for months," Darren confirmed. "Today's arrest, caught on camera with no justifiable cause, is going to be the catalyst. They can't hide behind their excuses anymore. The DOJ is ready to take this public, and when they do, the entire department will be exposed." The lawyers around the table nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about filing a civil suit for Darren's wrongful arrest. This was about taking down a corrupt system that had been operating unchecked for years. "What's our next move?" Taylor asked, his voice filled with a sense of urgency. Darren paused, glancing at his brother Malcolm, who had been sitting quietly, absorbing the information. Malcolm, a seasoned politician, understood how these situations could escalate, and how dangerous they could become. "We need to be strategic," Darren said. "We can't just rush into this. The DOJ will handle the criminal side of things, but we need to focus on the civil side. We need to file lawsuits not just against the officers involved in my arrest, but against the department itself. And we need to make sure that the community is behind us every step of the way." Malcolm nodded. "The community will back you, Darren. After today, there's no way this department is going to escape scrutiny. The people are already calling for reform, and this is the moment to push for real, lasting change." Darren's legal team began to map out their strategy, discussing the details of the lawsuits they would file and the evidence they had collected over the past several months. The DOJ investigation, combined with Darren's arrest, was about to blow the lid off Crestview PD's long history of misconduct. But Darren knew this wasn't just about one department. This was about setting a precedent for how police departments across the country would be held accountable for their actions. He had seen too many cases of racial profiling swept under the rug, too many instances where the victims never got justice. This time, it would be different. Before the meeting ended, Darren's phone buzzed with a message from Agent Williams, the federal agent who had visited the station earlier. The message was simple but clear. The investigation is moving forward. Get ready. Darren locked eyes with Malcolm, who gave him a firm nod. The fight was far from over, but Darren felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about him. This was about dismantling a system that had oppressed communities of color for far too long. And now, with the full weight of federal investigators behind him, Darren knew that change was coming, whether the Crestview Police Department was ready for it or not. The fallout from Darren's arrest was swift and severe. As the media storm surrounding the incident intensified, pressure mounted on the Crestview Police Department to take immediate action. Protests continued outside the station, growing larger and louder with each passing day. Civil rights groups, community leaders, and local activists all demanded accountability for what had happened. The town of Crestview, once a quiet and relatively uneventful suburb, was now the center of a national conversation on police misconduct and racial profiling. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was tense and grim. Officers whispered in the hallways, avoiding eye contact with one another. They had all seen the video, and they knew it didn't look good. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire of what was coming. Under immense pressure, Chief Angela Russo had no choice but to act. The calls for disciplinary measures against Sergeant Davis and Officer Wyatt were too loud to ignore, and Russo knew that if she didn't act swiftly, the entire department would be dragged down with them. In a hastily arranged press conference, Chief Russo stood before a crowd of reporters, flanked by the department's public relations officer. Her face was stern, but the fatigue in her eyes was undeniable. She was trying to contain the damage, but the situation had spiraled out of her control. "Good afternoon," Russo began, her voice tight. "I want to start by addressing the incident involving Mr. Darren Mitchell. After conducting a preliminary investigation into the circumstances surrounding his arrest, it has become clear that the actions of the officers involved were not in line with the standards and values of this department." The reporters leaned forward, their pens ready to capture every word. "As of today," Russo continued, "Sergeant Davis and Officer Wyatt have been placed on immediate suspension, pending the outcome of a full internal investigation. This department takes allegations of misconduct very seriously, and we are committed to holding our officers accountable." The reporters erupted into a flurry of questions, but Russo wasn't finished. "I also want to take this opportunity to apologize to Mr. Mitchell and his family for the wrongful arrest. This should never have happened, and we are taking steps to ensure that incidents like this do not happen again. We will be cooperating fully with the federal investigation and will make the necessary changes to address any systemic issues within the department." The press conference ended with a promise of reform, but the damage was already done. Crestview PD was now under the microscope, and the suspension of Davis and Wyatt was just the beginning. The community, and indeed the country, was demanding more than just temporary suspensions. They wanted real accountability, and they wanted justice. As news of the suspension spread, the reaction was mixed. Some in the community were relieved to see the officers being held responsible for their actions, while others felt that the suspensions were too little, too late. For Darren and his legal team, the suspensions were a step in the right direction, but they knew that real justice would only come when the entire system was reformed. Meanwhile, inside the police department, the atmosphere was one of fear and uncertainty. Officers who had once felt untouchable were now worried about their own futures. They knew that the federal investigation could lead to deeper revelations about the department's practices, and many feared that they could be next. Davis and Wyatt, who had been so confident during Darren's arrest, were now facing the harsh reality of their actions. Stripped of their badges and guns, they were sent home to await the outcome of the investigation. For the first time in their careers, they were on the other side of the law, and the weight of what they had done was finally starting to sink in. But for Darren, the suspensions were just the beginning. He wasn't interested in seeing just a few officers punished. He wanted systemic change. And with the federal investigation looming, he knew that the fight was far from over. As the weeks turned into months, Darren Mitchell's arrest became a national symbol of the need for police reform. The viral video of his wrongful arrest had ignited a movement, one that transcended the borders of Crestview and reached far beyond its suburban streets. Across the country, activists, civil rights leaders, and politicians rallied around Darren's story, using it as a catalyst to push for long-overdue changes in law enforcement. At the heart of the growing movement was the federal investigation into the Crestview Police Department. Agent Mark Williams and his team from the Department of Justice worked tirelessly, poring over years of reports, complaints, and internal documents. What they uncovered was a pattern of systemic abuse, racial profiling, excessive use of force, and a culture of impunity that had allowed officers like Davis and Wyatt to operate unchecked for far too long. The investigation culminated in a sweeping report that called for federal oversight of the department. The DOJ recommended immediate reforms, including mandatory de-escalation training, cultural sensitivity programs, and the establishment of an independent oversight board to review cases of misconduct. But perhaps the most significant recommendation was the introduction of body cameras for all officers, ensuring that every interaction with the public was recorded and could be reviewed for accountability. For Darren, this was a victory. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a major step forward. His wrongful arrest had exposed the deep flaws in Crestview PD's practices, and now, real change was happening. But Darren knew that the fight for justice didn't stop at the borders of Crestview. He had always been committed to national reform, and now, he had the platform to push for it. Darren began working closely with lawmakers, civil rights groups, and community organizations to draft new legislation aimed at reforming police practices across the country. His proposals included stronger federal oversight of local police departments, increased transparency in law enforcement, and the establishment of national standards for the use of force. Senator Malcolm Grant, Darren's brother, took the lead in Washington, introducing a comprehensive police reform bill that was inspired by Darren's experience. The bill called for sweeping changes, including the creation of a national database to track officers with a history of misconduct, the elimination of qualified immunity for police officers, and the establishment of independent review boards in every major city. The bill faced fierce opposition from police unions and some lawmakers, but Darren and Malcolm were undeterred. They launched a national campaign, rallying support from civil rights leaders, celebrities, and grassroots organizations. Protests and demonstrations were held in cities across the country, and the call for police reform became a defining issue in the national conversation. As the movement grew, Darren found himself in the spotlight, not as a victim, but as a leader. His calm, measured approach and his relentless commitment to justice made him a powerful voice in the fight for change. He was invited to speak at town halls, rallies, and even congressional hearings, where he shared his story and his vision for a better, more just system. In Crestview, the changes were already taking effect. Under federal oversight, the police department was forced to adopt new policies and procedures aimed at addressing the systemic issues that had plagued the department for years. Officers like Davis and Wyatt were no longer untouchable, and the community, once divided by mistrust, began to come together to demand accountability. But Darren knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Real change, he understood, didn't happen overnight. It took sustained effort, continued pressure, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But for the first time in a long time, Darren felt hopeful. The system that had wronged him was finally being held accountable, and he was determined to make sure that no one else would have to endure what he had. 6 months after his arrest, Darren stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, looking out at the sea of faces gathered for the national rally for police reform. His brother Malcolm stood beside him, and together, they prepared to address the crowd. As Darren stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent, waiting for his words. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, but also the strength of the movement behind him. "This isn't just about me," Darren began, his voice steady and strong. "This is about all of us. It's about building a system that treats every person with dignity and respect. It's about holding those in power accountable. And it's about making sure that justice isn't just a word. It's a reality for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in unison, and Darren felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. The fight for justice was far from over, but Darren was ready. He had been wronged, but now he was leading the charge for change, and the world was finally listening.